Welcome to this journey through one of the most disturbing mysteries of the Cold War space race. Before we begin, I invite you to leave in the comments where you are watching from and the exact time when you are listening to this narration. We are interested in knowing what places and at what times of day or night these stories reach you. On November 28, 1960, in a small attic room in Turin, Italy, two brothers heard a man die in space. His name was never recorded. His death was never acknowledged. His body was never recovered. But for 3 minutes and 47 seconds, Achille and Giovanni Battista Judica-Cordiglia listened to him suffocate 200 kilometers above the Earth, while the Soviet Union pretended he did not exist. The sound started at 9:17 in the evening, a crackling hiss that cut through the static on frequency 143.6 megahertz. Achille was 20 years old. He had been monitoring Soviet space communications for 6 months from a makeshift radio station he and his younger brother Giovanni had built in the attic of their family home. They called it Tower Bert, a joke. A tiny listening post in a residential neighborhood trying to intercept signals from the most secretive space program in the world. But on this night, Tower Bert intercepted something the Soviet Union never intended anyone to hear. Achille was wearing headphones. He was adjusting the frequency dial, trying to lock onto a carrier wave he had been tracking for the past hour. Soviet spacecraft transmitted on predictable frequencies. If you knew where to listen, if you had the right equipment, if you were patient, you could hear them. Most of the time, it was telemetry, data streams, heartbeat monitors, temperature readings, boring technical information that Achille would record on reel-to-reel tape and analyze later. But this signal was different. It was voice, human voice, speaking Russian, and the voice was terrified. Achille grabbed a notepad. He started transcribing. His Russian was basic, self-taught from textbooks and radio broadcasts. But he understood enough. The voice said, "Conditions. Conditions. I need conditions." Then breathing. Fast. Panicked. The kind of breathing that comes when your body realizes it is dying. The voice said, "Emergency. Provide me with emergency." Achille's hand froze. He looked at Giovanni, who was across the room, checking another frequency. "Giovanni," Achille said, "come here. Now." Giovanni walked over. He was 18, younger than Achille by 2 years, but just as obsessed with space. They had been amateur radio operators since they were teenagers, listening to satellites, tracking Soviet launches, trying to piece together what was happening behind the Iron Curtain when official news reports told them nothing. Giovanni put on a second pair of headphones. He listened. His face went pale. The voice said, "I am increasing, negative, negative." "What does that mean?" Giovanni whispered. "I think he is saying the pressure is increasing," Achille said. "Inside the capsule. Something is wrong with the atmospheric controls." The voice said, very warm, breathing difficult, breathing. "Oh God," Giovanni said. "He is suffocating." For the next 2 minutes, the Judica-Cordiglia brothers listened to a man die. They did not know his name. They did not know his mission. They did not know if anyone else was listening. All they knew was that somewhere above them, in the cold vacuum of space, a Soviet cosmonaut was running out of oxygen, and there was nothing anyone could do to save him. The breathing became slower, shallower. The voice stopped forming words, just sounds, gasps, wheezing, the terrible wet noise of lungs trying to pull oxygen from air that had none left to give. and then silence. Static. The carrier wave continued. The spacecraft was still transmitting, but the man inside it was dead. Achille and Giovanni sat in the attic room and stared at the reel-to-reel tape recorder that had captured everything. The tape spun slowly. Recording static now. Recording nothing. But 3 minutes and 47 seconds earlier, it had recorded proof that the Soviet Union had just lost a man in space. "We have to tell someone," Giovanni said. "We have to report this." Achille looked at his brother. "Report it to who? The Soviets will deny it. They always deny it. They did not even admit Sputnik failed until 2 years after it fell out of orbit. You think they are going to admit they killed a cosmonaut? Then who? The Americans." Achille stood up. He walked to the window and looked out at the quiet street below. Turin at night. Normal people living normal lives, sleeping, watching television, having dinner. None of them knowing that 200 kilometers above their heads, a man had just died alone in a metal coffin. "We tell everyone," Achille said. "We tell the press, we tell NASA, we tell the United Nations, we tell anyone who will listen. And we do not stop until someone acknowledges that this man existed, that he died, that the Soviet Union lied about it." Giovanni nodded. He rewound the tape. He played it again. The voice, the breathing, the silence. He listened 3 times. Each time it got worse. Each time the reality sank deeper. They had just witnessed a death. Not seen it. Not read about it. Heard it. In real time. As it happened. "We need to translate the whole thing properly," Giovanni said. "My Russian is not good enough. We need to know exactly what he said." Achille walked to a shelf and pulled down a Russian dictionary. They spent the next hour going through the recording line by line, word by word. Some phrases were clear, others were garbled by static, but the meaning was unmistakable. The cosmonaut had been trying to communicate with ground control. He had been reporting atmospheric failure. He had been asking for help. And no one had answered him. The final words on the tape, spoken so quietly they almost disappeared into the static, were, "Tell them. Tell them I tried." Achille wrote that down in his notebook. He underlined it. "Tell them I tried." A man's last words. A plea to be remembered. And the Soviet Union was going to pretend he never existed. The next morning, Achille called the offices of La Stampa, the major newspaper in Turin. He asked to speak to someone in the Foreign Affairs Department. He was transferred 3 times. Finally, a reporter named Carlo Benedetti answered. "I have evidence that the Soviet Union lost a cosmonaut yesterday," Achille said. "I have a recording of him dying in space." There was a long pause. Then Benedetti said, "How old are you?" 20. "But that does not matter. I have the recording. You can hear it yourself. How did you get this recording?" "I intercepted it. I have a radio station. I monitor Soviet space frequencies." Another pause. "You are telling me that you, a 20-year-old amateur radio operator, managed to intercept a classified Soviet transmission that no intelligence agency in the world has reported?" "Yes. Because they either did not hear it, or they are covering it up. But I have the tape. I can bring it to your office. You can verify it." Benedetti agreed to meet. 2 hours later, Achille walked into the La Stampa building carrying a reel-to-reel tape in a canvas bag. Benedetti was in his 40s, skeptical, and clearly thought this was going to be a waste of time. But he led Achille to a small conference room, set up a tape player, and listened. Achille watched Benedetti's face as the recording played, watched the skepticism fade, watched the realization set in. watched the reporter's hand move to his mouth as the breathing slowed and stopped. When the tape ended, Benedetti sat in silence for a full minute. Then he said, "Do you have any proof that this is a real Soviet transmission? Any way to verify the frequency? The timing? Anything?" Achille pulled out his logbook. He showed Benedetti the frequency logs, the timestamps, the directional antenna data that proved the signal had come from space, not from a ground station. He showed Benedetti 6 months of prior recordings, telemetry, voice communications, all on the same frequencies, all verified as Soviet. Benedetti leaned back in his chair. "If this is real, if you actually intercepted a Soviet cosmonaut dying in space, this is the biggest story of the year, maybe the decade. But if it is fake, if you fabricated this, you will destroy my career, and I will make sure you regret it." "It is real," Achille said, "and there is something else you should know. This is not the first one." Benedetti's eyes widened. "What? This is not the first cosmonaut I have heard die. There was another one 2 weeks ago, October 14th, same thing. Voice transmission, distress. Silence. I did not have enough evidence to be sure, but now I am sure. The Soviet Union is losing people in space, and they are hiding it." Benedetti stood up. He walked to the window, looked out at the street, turned back to Achille. "I need to verify this with linguists, with audio experts, with intelligence sources. If it checks out, we publish. But you need to understand something. The Soviet Union is not going to like this. They are going to deny it. They are going to call you a liar. They are going to say, this is Western propaganda. And if they can figure out who you are, they might do more than just deny it." Achille felt a chill run down his spine. But he nodded. "I understand. But someone has to tell the truth. Someone has to say these men existed, even if no one else will." 4 days later, La Stampa published the story. Front page, headline, "Italian Brothers Intercept Soviet Space Death." The article included spectral analysis of the audio, verification from 3 independent linguists that the voice was speaking Russian, confirmation from Italian intelligence that the frequency matched known Soviet space communications. The reaction was immediate and massive. International press picked up the story within hours. American newspapers ran it on page 1. British papers called it proof that the Soviets were reckless with human life. The United Nations issued a statement requesting that the Soviet Union provide transparency about its space program. And the Soviet Union issued a statement saying that Achille and Giovanni Judica-Cordiglia were lying. That no launch had occurred on November 28th. That the recording was fabricated. That the brothers were agents of Western propaganda, trying to undermine Soviet scientific achievements. Achille read the Soviet statement in his attic room. He looked at the tape recorder. At the shelves of recordings he and Giovanni had made. At the antenna outside the window pointed at the sky. And he made a decision. "If the Soviets are going to lie," Achille said to Giovanni, "then we are going to keep listening. We are going to record every transmission. We are going to document every death. And we are going to make sure that no matter how hard they try to erase these people, the world knows they existed." Giovanni looked at his brother. "That means we are going to be targets. The KGB does not like people who expose Soviet secrets." "I know," Achille said, "but we do not have a choice anymore. We heard that man die. We heard him beg someone to remember he tried. We cannot pretend that did not happen. We cannot just go back to normal life and forget about it. These cosmonauts deserve to be remembered. even if their own country refuses to acknowledge them. So the brothers kept listening. And over the next 3 years, they would intercept 8 more transmissions. 8 more voices, 8 more deaths, some suffocated, some burned on reentry, some simply faded into static and silence. And each time the Soviet Union would deny that any launch had occurred, would call the Judica-Cordiglia brothers liars and frauds, would threaten Italy with diplomatic consequences if the brothers were not silenced. But the brothers had made a promise. To the man who said, "Tell them I tried." To all the men and women who would follow. To the truth. And they would keep that promise, no matter what it cost them. Over the next 3 years, Achille and Giovanni Judica-Cordiglia intercepted 8 more transmissions from dying cosmonauts. 9 deaths total between November 1960 and October 1963. 9 voices that begged for help. 9 people that the Soviet Union claimed never existed. And with each recording, the brothers became more convinced they were documenting not just failures of technology, but murders, deliberate sacrifices, human beings launched into space without adequate testing, without sufficient life support, without realistic plans for rescue. All in the name of beating America to every milestone in the space race. This is the chronicle of those 9 voices, 9 deaths, 9 pieces of evidence that the Soviet Union tried to erase from history. Recording number 1, November 28, 1960. The suffocation. The transmission that started everything. The cosmonaut who said, "Tell them I tried." Achille and Giovanni would later learn, through leaked Soviet documents in 2007, that this man was likely Alexei Belakonev, a test pilot from the Soviet Air Force who had been selected for the cosmonaut program in 1959. He was 28 years old, married, 1 daughter. His official record said he died in a training accident. But the Judica-Cordiglia recording told the truth. He died in space when his oxygen recycling system failed. The Soviet Union launched him anyway, knowing the system was faulty. They gambled that he would complete the mission before the failure occurred. They lost the gamble. Belakonev lost his life. Recording number 2. December 7th, 1960. 1 week after Belakonev. This time the signal was weaker, more distant. Achille calculated it was coming from a higher orbit, maybe 400 kilometers. The transmission lasted only 45 seconds. It was a man's voice. He was not panicking. He was calm, resigned. He spoke in Russian, said, "I know I'm not coming back. I know this is the end. Tell my wife I love her. Tell my son to be brave. Tell them both I died doing something important." And then the signal cut out. Not faded, cut, like someone had flipped a switch. Achille believed the spacecraft had tumbled into an orientation where the antenna could no longer point at Earth. The cosmonaut was still alive, still orbiting, but silent, unable to transmit, unable to call for help, just waiting for his oxygen to run out. The brothers never intercepted another signal from him. His name was never confirmed. But in 2007, declassified Soviet files mentioned an unnamed cosmonaut who was lost on a high-altitude test flight, December 1960. The dates matched. The flight profile matched. The man existed, but the Soviets never admitted it. Recording number 3, February 17th, 1961. This was the transmission that made Giovanni sick, the one that made him leave Torre Bert for 3 days, because he could not bear to listen anymore. The cosmonaut was young. His voice sounded like he was in his early 20s. And he was not calm. He was terrified. He was crying, begging, saying the same phrase over and over in Russian. Do not let me die. Do not let me die. Please, someone, do not let me die. The transmission lasted 7 minutes. 7 minutes of a young man screaming into the void, knowing no one was coming to save him. And then his voice changed, got quieter, more confused. He said, "Why is it so dark? Why can I not see? Is this dying? Is this what dying feels like?" And then he stopped talking. The breathing continued for another 90 seconds. Shallow, irregular, and then silence. Giovanni threw up twice while listening to that recording. Achille sat with his head in his hands and cried. They were both shaking when the tape finished. This was not just intercepting signals anymore. This was witnessing murder, and they could not look away. Recording number 4, April 21st, 1961. 2 weeks after Yuri Gagarin became the first man in space, the official first man, the one the Soviets celebrated, the one who got parades and medals and his face on stamps. But Achille and Giovanni knew the truth. Gagarin was not the first. He was the first to survive. Before him came the dead, the erased, the ones like the cosmonaut they heard on April 21st, who transmitted for only 16 seconds. 16 seconds of static and breathing, and then one word. Goodbye. Just that. Goodbye. And then nothing. The brothers analyzed that transmission for hours, tried to extract more information, tried to figure out what happened, but there was nothing else. Just goodbye. Just a man accepting his death and saying farewell to no one in particular. To the earth, maybe. To humanity. To anyone listening. Goodbye. Recording number 5, May 17th, 1961. This was the transmission that would haunt Achille for the rest of his life. Because this was not a man's voice. It was a woman, and she was burning alive. The transmission started at 11:43 in the morning Turin time. Achille was alone in Torrebere. Giovanni was at university taking an exam. The voice came through the speakers clear and strong. A woman speaking Russian with a Ukrainian accent. She said, "Descent trajectory is wrong. Heat shield temperatures exceeding limits. I am reading 800 degrees and climbing. Ground control, do you copy? I need immediate abort procedures." The transmission continued. Her voice got higher, more panicked. She said, "I see flames. I see flames outside the window. The heat. The heat is... I cannot. It is burning. I am burning. Please, someone, make it stop. Make it stop." The screaming lasted 41 seconds. 41 seconds of a woman burning to death during reentry because something had gone wrong with her spacecraft's thermal protection. And then the transmission cut out. Not silence. Cut. The spacecraft had disintegrated, fallen through the atmosphere in pieces. And somewhere in the fragments was a woman who had been alive and conscious and burning until the very end. Achille sat in Torrebere and listened to that recording 3 times. Each time he hoped he had misheard. Each time he hoped it was not as bad as he remembered. But it was worse. Every time was worse. He called Giovanni at the university, told him to come home immediately. When Giovanni arrived and heard the recording, he punched the wall so hard he broke 2 knuckles. He screamed. Not words, just screaming. And then he sat on the floor and cried, while Achille called every journalist, every scientist, every government official they had contact with, and told them the Soviet Union just killed a woman in space. And we have the recording to prove it. Recording number 6, November 23rd, 1962, 18 months after the burning woman. This transmission was different. The cosmonaut was not dying, not yet. He was reporting mechanical failures, saying his craft was tumbling, saying he had lost attitude control, saying he was trying to stabilize before reentry. His voice was professional, controlled. He was following procedure, communicating status, requesting guidance. But no one answered him. The transmission continued for 8 minutes. His voice got more urgent, more frustrated. He said, "I have run through every emergency protocol. Nothing is responding. Thrusters are dead. Stabilizers are dead. I am spinning at increasing rate. I will not survive reentry like this. Ground control, if you can hear this, tell my family I did everything correctly. This was not pilot error. This was mechanical failure. Tell them I followed every procedure, and it was not enough." The transmission ended. No scream, no final words. Just the sound of static, and then nothing. The brothers later learned this cosmonaut probably survived re-entry, but died on impact, when his capsule hit the ground at terminal velocity without parachute deployment. His name was never released. His death was never acknowledged. Recording number 7. December 10th, 1962. 2 weeks after the previous death. This time the transmission was barely audible. The signal was weak, distorted. The cosmonaut sounded exhausted. He said, "Oxygen levels critical. I have maybe 10 minutes left. I wanted to see Earth from space. I wanted to do something important. I wanted." His voice trailed off. Silence for 30 seconds. Then he said, "It is beautiful up here. I wish everyone could see this. I wish I could tell them what it looks like, how small everything seems, how fragile." The transmission faded, came back briefly. He said, "Tell them it was worth it. Even like this, even dying. It was worth it to see." And then gone. Static. Nothing. Achille wrote in his log that night, he died thinking it was worth it. He died alone and suffocating, and he still thought it was beautiful. What kind of person does that to someone? What kind of government? Recording number 8. June 14th, 1963. This transmission lasted only 11 seconds. A man's voice, barely audible. He said, "Impact in 5 seconds. Parachute failed. I am sorry." And then a sound. A terrible crashing sound. And then nothing. The cosmonaut had time to say, "I am sorry," before his capsule hit the ground and killed him instantly. Sorry for failing. Sorry for dying. Sorry for not being good enough to survive. Achille and Giovanni did not speak for 2 hours after hearing that recording. They just sat in Turin and stared at the equipment and wondered how many more times they would have to hear people apologize for dying. Recording number 9, October 7th, 1963. The final transmission. The last death the brothers would document. This cosmonaut was different. He was angry. He was not begging, not accepting, not apologizing. He was furious. He said, "You did this. You sent me up here knowing the systems were not ready. You gambled with my life and you lost. I hope someone hears this. I hope someone knows what you did. My name is..." The transmission cut out. He tried to give his name, tried to identify himself, tried to make sure someone would remember. But the signal died before he could finish. His name remained unknown. His death remained unacknowledged. But his anger remained on tape, preserved. Evidence that at least one cosmonaut understood exactly what had been done to him. And he wanted the world to know. 9 recordings, 9 voices, 9 deaths. Between 1960 and 1963, Achille and Giovanni Judica-Cordiglia documented a secret history of the Soviet space program. A history written in screams and final words and terrible silences. A history the Soviet Union spent decades trying to erase. But the brothers kept the tapes, kept the logs, kept the evidence, and they continued telling anyone who would listen that these people existed, that they died, that they deserved to be remembered. And with each recording, each death, each denial from the Soviet Union, the brothers became more certain of one truth. They were not documenting accidents. They were documenting a program that valued victory more than human life, that launched people into space knowing they might not come back, that sacrificed cosmonauts like chess pieces in a game against America. And someone needed to hold them accountable, even if it meant making enemies of one of the most powerful governments in the world. Of all the recordings the Judica-Cordiglia brothers intercepted, one haunted them more than any other. Recording number 5, May 17th, 1961. The woman who burned alive during reentry. For 41 seconds, Achille and Giovanni listened to her scream as fire consumed her spacecraft. And for the next 43 years, Achille would dedicate every spare moment to answering one question. Who was she? The Soviet Union never acknowledged her existence, never released her name, never admitted that a woman had died in space 2 years before Valentina Tereshkova became the first official female cosmonaut in 1963. But Achille knew she existed. He had her voice on tape. He had her last words. And he refused to let her be erased from history. The investigation started the same day as the recording. Achille sat in Turin and listened to the transmission over and over. He transcribed every word, analyzed every inflection, tried to extract any clue about her identity. The voice was female, young, maybe mid-20s. She spoke Russian with a Ukrainian accent. That narrowed it slightly. Ukraine was a major recruiting ground for Soviet pilots and cosmonauts. The voice was trained, professional. She used technical terminology correctly. Heat shield, descent trajectory, abort procedures. This was not a civilian. This was someone with extensive aerospace training, probably a test pilot, possibly military. But finding a name was nearly impossible. The Soviet space program was classified at every level. Cosmonaut candidates were state secrets. Training programs were conducted behind closed doors, and any woman in the program would have been even more carefully hidden. In 1961, the idea of women in space was controversial even in the progressive West. In the Soviet Union, where gender roles were more traditional despite communist propaganda, a female cosmonaut would have been a carefully managed propaganda tool. If she succeeded, she would be celebrated. If she failed, she would be erased. This woman failed, and the Soviet Union erased her. Achille started with public records. He searched Soviet newspapers for mentions of female pilots who had disappeared or died in training accidents between 1958 and 1961. The space program had started recruiting in earnest after Sputnik in 1957. Anyone sent into space in May 1961 would have been in training for at least 2 years, probably longer. He found 12 names. 12 women who had been test pilots or military aviators, who had either died in unexplained accidents or simply disappeared from public record between 1958 and 1961. 12 possibilities, but no way to verify which one, if any, was the woman on the tape. Giovanni suggested they send the recording to linguistics experts. Maybe someone could identify the specific regional accent. Narrow down where in Ukraine the woman was from. Achille agreed. They made copies of the tape and sent them to 3 different universities. Moscow State University refused to analyze it, called it Western propaganda. But 2 Western universities, Oxford in England and MIT in America, agreed to examine the recording. The results came back 6 months later. Both universities confirmed the voice was female, Ukrainian accent, specifically from the Kiev region. The Oxford report noted something else. The woman's speech patterns suggested she was educated, possibly university trained. She used complex sentence structures, formal grammar. This was not someone who had grown up in rural poverty and joined the military for economic reasons. This was someone from an educated family, someone who had chosen aviation as a career. That detail changed everything. Educated Ukrainian women who became test pilots in the late 1950s were extremely rare. There might have been only a handful in the entire Soviet Union. Achille went back to his list of 12 names and cross-referenced with educational records he could access through Italian intelligence contacts. 3 names emerged as possibilities: Ludmila Ponomariova, Irina Solovyova, and Zhana Yorkina. All 3 were from the Kiev region. All 3 had university education. All 3 had become military test pilots. And all 3 had disappeared from public records between 1959 and 1961. Achille focused on Ludmila first. She had been the most prominent of the 3. Born 1934 in Kiev. Graduated from Kiev Polytechnic Institute in 1955 with a degree in aeronautical engineering. Joined the Soviet Air Force in 1956. Became a test pilot in 1958. And then nothing. No records after March 1961. No death announcement. No transfer notice. No mention in military publications. She simply vanished. Achille tried to contact her family, found an address in Kiev for her parents, sent a letter asking if they had any information about their daughter's whereabouts. The letter was returned unopened, with a stamp that said, "Addressee unknown." He tried again. Same result. It was clear that someone was intercepting his correspondence. Someone did not want him asking questions about Ludmila Ponomariova. In 1964, Achille received an unexpected visitor. A man knocked on the door of the Judica-Cordiglia family home in Turin. He introduced himself as Dmitry Volkov. Said he was a Soviet citizen who had defected to Italy 6 months earlier. Said he had information about the woman on the recording. Achille was immediately suspicious. This could be a KGB trap, a way to silence him or discredit him. But curiosity won. He invited Volkov inside. Volkov was nervous. His hands shook as he accepted coffee from Achille's mother. He looked over his shoulder constantly as if expecting someone to burst through the door. When they were alone in Torrebert, Volkov finally spoke. "I worked in the Soviet space program," Volkov said. "Not as a cosmonaut. As an engineer. I was part of the team that designed life support systems. And I know about the woman you recorded. Her name was Ludmila Ponomariova. She was 27 years old. She was chosen for a secret mission in early 1961. The mission was supposed to be a propaganda coup. First woman in space, beat the Americans. Beat everyone. But something went wrong." "What went wrong?" Achille asked. Volkov looked down at his hands. The heat shield installation was defective. "We knew it was defective. We told the program directors. But they said there was no time to fix it. The launch window was closing. The Americans were preparing their own missions. We had to go now, or lose the opportunity. So they launched anyway. They sent Ludmila into space knowing the heat shield might fail. And when it did fail, when she started burning on re-entry, they cut the communication link. They did not want anyone to hear her die. But somehow you did? Achille felt something cold settle in his stomach. They knew? They knew the heat shield was defective and they launched her anyway. Volkov nodded. They gambled that it would hold long enough, that she would make it through re-entry before catastrophic failure. They lost the gamble. Ludmila lost her life. And I was there. I helped install that heat shield. I knew it was not ready. And I said nothing because I was afraid. Afraid I would lose my job. Afraid I would be punished. I am as guilty as anyone. What happened to her body? Achille asked. Volkov looked up. His eyes were wet. There was no body. The spacecraft disintegrated completely during re-entry. Pieces fell over Siberia. They sent recovery teams but found almost nothing. Just fragments. Burned metal. Nothing identifiable. Ludmila was cremated by the atmosphere. There is nothing left of her, except the recording you made. You are the only proof she existed. Achille looked at the tape on the shelf. The reel that contained 41 seconds of Ludmila Ponomariova screaming as she burned alive. He thought about her last words. Please, someone, make it stop. Make it stop. She had been begging someone to end her pain, and no one had been listening except two brothers in Italy who could do nothing except record her death. After Volkov left, Achille sat in Torrebert for a long time. He thought about Ludmila, about who she had been, an educated woman from Kiev who had dreamed of flying, who had worked hard to become a test pilot, who had been chosen for the greatest achievement in human history, first woman in space, and who had been killed by negligence and political pressure and the Soviet Union's desperate need to win at any cost. Achille decided something that night. Ludmila Ponomariova deserved more than just a recording. She deserved to have her story told. She deserved to be remembered as more than just a voice on a tape. So Achille started writing. He wrote everything Volkov had told him, everything he had researched, everything he knew or suspected about Ludmila's life and death. He wrote a biography of a woman he had never met. A woman whose only contact with him had been 41 seconds of screaming transmitted from orbit. He tried to publish the biography in 1965. Every publisher refused. Too controversial. Too unverifiable. Too likely to anger the Soviet Union. So Achille kept it, stored it with the tapes, waited for a time when the truth could be told without fear. In 1967, Achille received a letter. It had no return address but was postmarked from Kiev. Inside was a single photograph. The photograph showed a young woman in a Soviet Air Force uniform. She was smiling. Behind her was a MiG fighter jet. On the back of the photograph, someone had written in Russian, Ludmila Ponomariova, test pilot. 1960. She was our daughter. Thank you for remembering her. Achille held the photograph and cried, because this meant Ludmila's parents knew. They knew what had happened to their daughter. They knew she had died in space. They knew the Soviet Union had lied about it. And they knew that somewhere in Italy, two brothers were trying to make sure their daughter was not forgotten. The photograph joined the tape on the shelf in Torrebert. Evidence that Ludmila Ponomariova had existed, that she had been a real person, a daughter, a pilot, a woman who had dreamed of the stars and died reaching for them. The Soviet Union could erase her from official records, could deny she ever flew, could refuse to acknowledge her sacrifice. But they could not erase the photograph, could not erase the tape, could not erase the memory of two Italian brothers and two grieving parents who refused to forget. For the next 43 years, Achille carried that photograph with him, showed it to journalists, to historians, to anyone who would listen. And he told them the same thing every time. Her name was Lyudmila Ponomariova. She was the first woman to die in space, and she deserves to be remembered. In 2007, when Soviet archives were partially declassified, researchers found a file labeled Project Venus. Inside were documents about a secret program to send a woman into space in May 1961. The cosmonaut's name was redacted, but the mission profile matched exactly what Volkov had described. Launch date: May 17, 1961. Mission duration: 4 hours. Reentry: catastrophic failure. Cause: heat shield malfunction. Status: total loss. And at the bottom of the file, a single notation in red ink: participant identity classified indefinitely. No memorial, no acknowledgement. Destroy all evidence. But the evidence had not been destroyed, because two brothers in Turin had been listening, and they had recorded everything. And now, decades later, the world finally knew. Lyudmila Ponomariova had flown, had burned, had died, and her last words had been preserved, not by her own government, but by two strangers who believed she deserved to be remembered, who believed that every voice, no matter how briefly heard, mattered, who believed that the truth was worth fighting for even when the entire Soviet Union stood against them. The Soviet Union tried to silence the Judica-Cordiglia brothers 17 times between 1961 and 1991. 17 documented attempts to stop them from recording, from publishing, from telling the world about the cosmonauts who died in secret. Some attempts were subtle: diplomatic pressure, economic threats. Others were not subtle at all: fire, theft, violence. But Achille and Giovanni refused to stop, because they had made a promise to 9 dead cosmonauts, and promises to the dead are not easily broken. The first attempt came in June 1961, 1 month after Lyudmila Ponomariova burned to death. The Soviet embassy in Rome issued a formal complaint to the Italian government. The complaint stated that Achille and Giovanni Judica-Cordiglia were engaged in illegal surveillance of Soviet state communications, that they were violating international law, that they were spreading false information designed to undermine Soviet prestige. The complaint demanded that the Italian government shut down Toribert immediately and confiscate all recordings. The Italian government refused. Technically, the brothers were not breaking any laws. Monitoring radio frequencies was legal for amateur operators. The Soviets could not prove the recordings were falsified. And Italy had no interest in doing the Soviet Union's censorship work for them. The complaint was filed and ignored. But the Soviets did not give up. 2 weeks later, Achille received a phone call. The voice on the other end spoke Italian with a Russian accent. The voice said, "You are causing problems for people who do not like problems. You should stop before something unfortunate happens." Achille asked who was calling. The line went dead. 3 days after the phone call, someone broke into Toribert while the family was at church. The attic had been locked. The lock was broken. Professionally. Not smashed. Picked. Someone who knew what they were doing. The intruder had gone through the equipment, opened cabinets, searched shelves, but they had not taken anything. At first. Then Achille checked the tape archive. One tape was missing. Recording number 5. Ludmila, the woman who burned. The tape that proved a woman had died in space before Valentina Tereshkova. Achille stood in the attic and felt rage boil up inside him. They had stolen evidence, evidence of murder, evidence that could never be replaced. But then Giovanni walked over to a different cabinet, opened it, pulled out an identical tape. "We made copies," Giovanni said. "Remember? After the first attempt to dismiss us as liars, we made copies of everything. The Soviets just stole a backup. The original is still safe." Achille wanted to laugh, wanted to cry, wanted to find whoever had broken in and show them that they had failed. But he did not, because he realized something. If the Soviets were willing to break into their home, they were willing to do worse. And next time, they might not just steal a tape. They might steal everything, or burn it, or destroy it beyond recovery. That night, Achille and Giovanni made a decision. They would create multiple backup copies of every recording, store them in different locations, give copies to journalists they trusted, to universities, to archives, distribute the evidence so widely that it could not all be destroyed, make it impossible for the Soviets to erase what they had documented. Over the next year, they made 27 copies of the complete archive, sent them to contacts in 6 countries, stored copies in safety deposit boxes, gave copies to their lawyer with instructions that if anything happened to them, the tapes should be released to the press immediately. They turned their evidence into a dead man's switch. The Soviets could kill them, but they could not silence them. In November 1962, the Italian government received another Soviet complaint. This one was more aggressive. The Soviets threatened to cancel a major trade agreement worth millions of lire. They threatened to withdraw from cultural exchange programs. They threatened to make Italy's diplomatic relationship with the Eastern Bloc very difficult. All because of 2 brothers with a radio station in an attic. This time, the Italian government sent someone to talk to Achille. A foreign ministry official named Marco Antonelli arrived at the Judica-Cordiglia home and explained the situation. "You are causing problems for Italy," Antonelli said. "The Soviets are using you as leverage. They want us to shut you down. And while I personally believe your recordings are genuine, I need you to understand that there are larger diplomatic considerations at play." Achille looked at Antonelli. "Are you asking us to stop? Are you asking us to let the Soviets get away with murder because it is diplomatically inconvenient?" Antonelli shifted uncomfortably. "I am asking you to consider the consequences, not just for yourselves, for Italy, for international relations. These are complicated times. The Cold War is not a game. People die over less than this." "People are already dying," Achille said. 9 cosmonauts that we know of. Maybe more. And the Soviets are covering it up. If we stop now, if we let them intimidate us into silence, then those cosmonauts died for nothing. No one will remember them. No one will hold the Soviets accountable. Is that what you want? Is that what Italy stands for? Antonelli stood up. He looked at Achille for a long moment. Then he said something unexpected. "Off the record? Keep doing what you are doing. But be careful. The Soviets have a long reach, and they do not forgive people who embarrass them." After Antonelli left, Giovanni said, "We need to be more careful. We need security. We need to protect ourselves." They installed better locks on Torabert, set up motion sensors, got a dog, a large German shepherd that barked at strangers. They varied their daily routines, never followed the same patterns twice, checked their car for tampering before driving, started living like they were targets, because they were. In March 1965, Torre caught fire. 3 a.m. Achille woke to the smell of smoke. He ran to the attic. The door was already hot. He kicked it open and saw flames consuming the radio equipment, the tapes, everything. Giovanni appeared with a fire extinguisher. They fought the fire for 10 minutes before the fire brigade arrived. By the time the flames were out, half of Torre was destroyed. The fire inspector ruled it electrical malfunction, old wiring, overloaded circuits, accidental. But Achille knew better. The wiring had been inspected 2 months earlier. Everything was up to code. This was not an accident. This was arson. Someone had set fire to Torre. Someone had tried to destroy the evidence, and they had almost succeeded. Almost. Because the tapes that burned were the working copies. The backups were safe, stored elsewhere. The Soviets had destroyed equipment worth thousands of lire, but they had not destroyed the recordings, had not destroyed the proof, had not silenced the brothers. Achille and Giovanni rebuilt Torre in 6 months. Better equipment, better security, better fire suppression system. They used insurance money and donations from supporters who believed in what they were doing. And they sent a message to the Soviet Union through the press. You burned our equipment, but not our resolve. We are still listening. We are still recording. We are still telling the truth. The attempts to silence them became more sophisticated after the fire. In 1968, someone hacked their bank accounts, stole their savings. It took 8 months to recover the money. In 1970, Giovanni was attacked walking home from university. 3 men. No words. Just fists. Giovanni spent a week in the hospital with broken ribs and a concussion. The men were never caught. In 1973, the Italian tax authorities suddenly decided the Judica-Cordiglia family owed back taxes for unreported income. The audit was aggressive, punitive. It took 2 years and a lawsuit to prove the charges were fabricated. Each attack took a toll. Financially, physically, emotionally. But the brothers never stopped, never surrendered, never let the Soviets win. Because every attack proved they were right. Proved the recordings were real. Proved the Soviet Union was desperate to hide the truth. Innocent governments do not break into homes and burn equipment and beat people in the street. Guilty governments do those things. And every attack made the brothers more certain that what they were doing mattered. In 1975, Giovanni made a decision. He left Italy, moved to Belgium. Not because he was giving up, because he realized that if both brothers were in the same place, one attack could eliminate them both. So Giovanni took copies of all the recordings and moved to Brussels, established a backup archive, created redundancy, made sure that if something happened to Achille, the evidence would survive. Achille understood. He did not want his brother to leave. But he knew it was the right decision. Now the Soviets would have to silence 2 people in 2 countries. Twice the difficulty. Twice the risk. Twice the chance of failure. The separation was hard. The brothers had worked together for 15 years, had listened to 9 cosmonauts die together, had fought the Soviet Union together. Now they were separated by 1,000 kilometers, but they stayed in contact. Weekly phone calls, monthly visits, and always they kept the tapes safe, kept the evidence secure, kept the promise to the dead. In 1979, something changed. A Soviet journalist named Yaroslav Golovanov published an article in Pravda admitting that the Soviet space program had experienced failures. Not deaths, not cover-ups, just failures, technical difficulties, setbacks. It was the first time the Soviet government had acknowledged anything going wrong. It was not the truth, not even close, but it was a crack in the wall of lies. Achille read the article and felt something like hope. Maybe the Soviets were finally ready to admit what had happened. Maybe glasnost and perestroika would bring transparency. Maybe the cosmonauts who died in secret would finally be acknowledged. He was wrong. The Soviet Union admitted minor failures to maintain credibility. But the deaths remained classified. The cover-up continued. The Judica-Cordiglia brothers remained targets. In 1985, Achille received a visitor, a young Soviet man who introduced himself as Konstantin Feoktistov, said he was the son of one of the cosmonauts who died, said his father's name was Grigory Feoktistov, said he had been erased from Soviet records after dying in a training accident that was actually a launch failure. Konstantin had tracked down the Judica-Cordiglia brothers because he had heard they kept records of secret Soviet space deaths. "Do you have a recording of my father?" Konstantin asked. "Do you have proof he died in space?" Achille checked his logs, found a transmission from April 1962 that matched the timeline Konstantin described. Played the tape. The voice said, "Oxygen system failure. I cannot breathe. Tell my son I love him. Tell Konstantin I love him." Konstantin listened to his father's last words and collapsed, sobbed. Achille sat with him. Let him grieve. When Konstantin finally spoke, he said, "Thank you. Thank you for keeping this, for remembering him. The Soviet Union told us he died in a car accident. We had a state funeral. They gave us a medal. But we never knew the truth. Now I know. He died a hero. He died doing something important. And someone recorded it. Someone cared enough to preserve his voice. That moment, that connection between a recording and a grieving son, crystallized everything for Achille. This was why they endured the attacks, why they rebuilt after the fire, why they kept fighting despite the threats and the violence and the exhaustion. Because somewhere out there were families who needed to know the truth, who deserved to hear their loved ones' last words, who had been lied to by their own government and needed someone, anyone, to tell them what really happened. The Soviet Union collapsed in 1991. The Berlin Wall fell. The Iron Curtain lifted. Archives began opening. And slowly, painfully, the truth about the Lost Cosmonauts started emerging. Not all of it, not fast. But piece by piece, the Soviet space program's dark history was revealed. And every revelation proved the Judica-Cordiglia brothers had been right all along. On December 23, 2007, 47 years after Achille Judica-Cordiglia first heard a man die in space, the Russian government released a document that changed everything. File number 738-K, classified since 1960, 183 pages of mission reports, technical failures, and casualty lists from the early Soviet space program. The document confirmed what the Judica-Cordiglia brothers had been saying for nearly half a century. The Soviet Union had lost multiple cosmonauts before admitting any failures, and they had covered it up systematically, completely, and ruthlessly. Achille was 67 years old when the files were declassified. Giovanni had died 3 years earlier of a heart attack at age 63. The brothers never got to celebrate their vindication together. But on the day the files were released, Achille sat in what remained of Toribert and read through the document with tears streaming down his face. Because every name, every date, every cause of death matched the recordings they had made. The Soviet government was finally admitting the truth, and it proved the brothers had been right all along. The document listed 11 cosmonauts who died between 1957 and 1964. 7 of the 11 matched transmissions the Judica-Cordiglia brothers had intercepted. The other 4 had died in circumstances where no transmission was possible. Launch pad explosions, training accidents, equipment failures that killed instantly. But 7 of the deaths had been exactly as Achille and Giovanni had documented. Suffocation, reentry failure, oxygen depletion, fire. The first name on the list was Alexei Belakonev. Died November 28, 1960. Cause of death: atmospheric control system failure during orbital flight. Age: 28. The file included a photograph. A young man in a flight suit, smiling. The same man whose voice Achille and Giovanni had heard saying, "Tell them I tried." The man who started everything. Now he had a name, a face, a confirmed existence. The file listed others. Ivan Couture. Died February 17, 1961. Cause of death: oxygen deprivation during unplanned orbital extension. Age: 24. The young man who had cried and begged, "Do not let me die." Valentin Bondarenko. Died April 21, 1961. Cause of death: impact trauma following parachute failure. Age: 26. The man who had said goodbye. Each name confirmed. Each death verified. Each recording validated. But one name was conspicuously absent. File 738-K listed 10 male cosmonauts who died. But recording number 5, the woman who burned during reentry on May 17, 1961, was not mentioned. The file had no entry for May 1961. No female cosmonaut, no reentry failure, nothing. It was as if that transmission had never happened, as if Lyudmila Ponomaryova had never existed. Achille was not surprised. He had learned over 47 years that some truths were harder to admit than others. The Soviet Union could acknowledge that male cosmonauts died, could frame it as acceptable losses in the pursuit of scientific achievement. But admitting they had sent a woman into space with defective equipment and burned her alive, that was a different level of failure. That suggested recklessness that went beyond acceptable risk. So they erased her, even in the declassified files, even decades later. Lyudmila remained classified, but Achille had the recording, had the photograph her parents sent, had Dmitry Volkov's testimony, had 47 years of research, and he was not going to let her be forgotten. Not now. Not when the truth was finally being acknowledged. In January 2008, Achille published a book, 50 years of research compiled into 300 pages. The Lost Cosmonauts, a complete history of the Soviet space program's covered-up deaths. The book included transcripts of all 9 recordings, technical analysis, linguistic verification, historical context, and an entire chapter dedicated to Lyudmila Ponomaryova, her life, her training, her death. Everything Achille had been able to piece together over nearly half a century. The book became an international sensation, published in 12 languages, featured on television documentaries, cited by historians and aerospace experts. The Judica-Cordiglia brothers, once dismissed as conspiracy theorists and propagandists, were suddenly vindicated. Journalists who had mocked them apologized. Governments that had ignored them issued statements acknowledging their contribution to historical truth. And most importantly, families of the lost cosmonauts finally learned what had happened to their loved ones. Konstantin Feoktistov, the man who had visited Achille in 1985 to hear his father's last words, wrote the foreword to the book. He described what it meant to finally have official confirmation that his father had died a hero, that he had not died in a meaningless car accident, but in pursuit of humanity's greatest achievement, that his sacrifice had meaning. And he thanked the Judica-Cordiglia brothers for preserving that truth when no one else would. But the most significant response came from an unexpected source. In March 2008, Achille received a letter from Russia. The return address was Kiev. Inside was a handwritten note in Russian. Achille had it translated. The note said, "My name is Yevgenia Ponomaryova. Ludmila was my aunt. My father was her younger brother. Our family has never stopped searching for the truth about what happened to her. Thank you for remembering her. Thank you for fighting for her. Thank you for making sure she was not erased. We would like to meet you." 3 months later, Achille flew to Kiev. It was his first trip to Ukraine, his first time visiting the country where Ludmila had grown up. Yevgenia met him at the airport. She was 52 years old, had Ludmila's eyes, Ludmila's smile. They drove to the Ponomaryov family home where Ludmila's remaining relatives had gathered. Aunts, uncles, cousins, all the family who remembered the bright young woman who had dreamed of flying and died reaching for the stars. They showed Achille family photographs, Ludmila as a child, Ludmila graduating from university, Ludmila in her Air Force uniform, standing beside a fighter jet. Each photograph, a piece of the woman whose voice Achille had heard screaming as she burned. Each image making her more real, more human, more than just a recording. Ludmila's mother had died in 1998, her father in 2003. Both had gone to their graves knowing their daughter had died in space, but unable to prove it. Unable to have her sacrifice acknowledged. Unable to give her the memorial she deserved. But before she died, Ludmila's mother had written a letter. She had given it to Yevgenia with instructions. If anyone ever proved Ludmila died in space, give them this letter. Yevgenia handed the letter to Achille. It was dated April 2001, 7 years earlier. The handwriting was shaky, elderly, but the words were clear. The letter was addressed to whoever finds the truth. The letter said, "My daughter Ludmila was chosen for a great honor. She was going to be the first woman in space. She was excited, nervous, proud. When she left for training, she hugged me and said she would make me proud. She said she would show the world that women could do anything men could do. She said she was not afraid." 2 months later, men in government uniforms came to our house. They said Ludmila had died in a training accident. They said it was classified. They said we could not talk about it. They said if we asked questions, we would be punished. They gave us a small pension and told us to forget. But a mother does not forget her daughter. I knew they were lying. I knew something terrible had happened, but I did not know what until 1967, when someone sent us a newspaper article from Italy. 2 brothers had recorded Soviet cosmonauts dying in space. One of them was a woman in May 1961. The dates matched, the description matched, and I knew. I knew my Ludmila had not died in a training accident. She had died in space, and these Italian brothers were the only people in the world trying to tell her story. So I sent them a photograph. I wanted them to know she was real, that she had a family, that someone remembered her. And now, all these years later, if you are reading this, it means someone finally proved the truth. Thank you. Thank you for giving my daughter back her name. Thank you for making sure she is remembered. She died doing something brave, something important. And she deserves to be honored, not erased, not forgotten, honored, with love, Svetlana Ponomaryova. Achille finished reading the letter and could not speak. He sat in the Ponomaryov family home surrounded by people who loved Ludmila and finally understood what the last 47 years had been about. It had not been about proving the Soviets wrong. Not really. It had been about honoring promises. Promises to the dead. Promises to families. Promises that someday, somehow, the truth would matter more than politics. In July 2009, the Ukrainian government held a memorial ceremony for Ludmila Ponomaryova, officially acknowledged her as a cosmonaut, officially admitted she had died in space, officially recognized her sacrifice. The ceremony was held at the National Museum of History in Kiev. Achille was invited as the guest of honor. He stood beside Yevgenia and watched as a plaque was unveiled. The plaque read, Ludmila Ponomaryova, 1934 to 1961, test pilot, cosmonaut, pioneer, the first woman to die in space. She flew so others could soar. After the ceremony, journalists asked Achille how it felt to finally be vindicated, to have spent 47 years fighting for recognition and finally receiving it. Achille thought about the question, thought about Giovanni who did not live to see this day, thought about the 9 cosmonauts whose voices he had recorded, thought about 47 years of being called a liar and a fraud and a conspiracy theorist. And he said, "Vindication feels like relief, like a weight I have been carrying for half my life, has finally been lifted. But it also feels like sadness, because 9 people had to die for this truth to matter, because governments lied for decades, because families grieved without answers, and because my brother did not live to see this day. So yes, I am glad the truth is finally acknowledged, but I wish it had not taken 47 years. Achille Judica-Cordiglia died in June 2010 at age 69. Heart failure. He died in Turin, in the same house where Torre Bear had been built, where he and Giovanni had first heard a man die in space 50 years earlier. He died knowing that the cosmonauts he had recorded were finally being remembered, that their families had answers, that history would not forget them. At his funeral, representatives from NASA attended. From Roscosmos, the Russian space agency, from the Italian space agency, all acknowledging the contribution the Judica-Cordiglia brothers had made to space history. Not through flying, not through engineering, but through listening, through caring, through refusing to let the truth be buried. The recordings are now in the Smithsonian National Air and Space Museum. Preserved, digitized, available to researchers and historians. Torre Bear no longer exists. The attic was converted back to storage decades ago. But a plaque marks the building. The plaque says, "Here, 2 brothers listened to the stars and heard the voices of the forgotten. Here, truth was recorded when governments lied. Here, 9 cosmonauts were remembered when their own countries erased them. And somewhere in space, debris from 9 failed missions still orbits Earth. Metal fragments, burned pieces, physical evidence of the cosmonauts who died in secret. They orbit in silence now, but their voices remain, preserved on tape, testimony to courage and sacrifice, and the terrible cost of the space race, and testimony to two brothers who believed that every voice, no matter how briefly heard, deserves to be remembered. Who believed that truth matters even when it is inconvenient. Who believed that promises to the dead are the most sacred promises of all. The lost cosmonauts are lost no longer. Their names are known, their deaths acknowledged, their sacrifice honored. Not because governments admitted the truth, but because two brothers in Turin refused to let them be forgotten.